Today we're going to be discussing settings. The importance of having a spot, as I discussed in the previous post, was that you get to have an idea of what the light does in different environments. So going back to the same location multiple times gives you an opportunity to check various settings under various ambient light conditions. As you can see behind me, I'm at downtown San Diego. It's pretty late at night. There's heavy fog cover over San Diego, so there's really not a lot of dynamic clouds in the sky. So tonight I won't really be experimenting with movement. Everybody has different tastes. My taste typically is I don't go out unless there's a lot of white fluffy clouds in the sky, but sometimes you take what you can get. Now, one of the things that I like to do is set up different types of shots at night. I'll do shorter shots and more long exposure shots, but every time I go out I have the same basic settings. ISO 400, 30 seconds at f3.5. Now I know what you're thinking. A lot of people say start out at f8 or start out at f11 when you're shooting landscapes at night. I found that by compressing the aperture down to a smaller aperture at f11 or f8, you lose a little bit of that light. But when you open up that aperture all the way, you get a lot more dynamic range, a lot more light in the evening because the light is so diffused. Nights like tonight where there's pretty much no moon, there's not a lot of light to work with. So I set the ISO to 400, I set the f-stop to f3.5 and fired off 30-second shot. And what I got was pretty blown out. This is just a test shot. I have the same test shot every single time. This lets me know what the light's doing. It gives me sort of a baseline of what my exposure is. From there, I know, like tonight, if the image is too blown out at that setting, then I lower it down. So I went from 400 to 100 ISO, and I got a really awesome photograph. From there, if it's still a little too hot, my variable that I change is not the aperture, but in fact it's the time. I reduced the amount of time, so I went from 30 seconds down to 10 seconds. And what I got was pretty awesome. It's exactly what I was looking for. So you have to play around with your settings and figure out your own taste. Some people like it to look more dramatic. They like the nighttime to look more like nighttime. I like nighttime to look a little bit more like daytime. I like to take advantage of all the color and the range that's there. You get a lot more purples and pinks and whatnot, as I said in the previous post. One of the biggest concerns and things I hear about from a lot of other photographers is how do you get a focus at night? Getting a focus lock at night can be very complicated if you're not shooting an environment like the San Diego cityscape. If it's a cityscape, you put your focus point on a heavy light source, and then from there it's easy to get a focus lock. But when you're shooting a landscape at night up in the mountains or at the beach where there is no light, you have to get a little tricky. I found a lot of times using a flashlight, you can buy 2 million candle power lights at Home Depot for less than 20 bucks. Sometimes just bringing a small handheld tactical light will do the trick. LEDs are really powerful. Gives you enough juice to get the focus lock, and then you of course turn off the light source and lock your focus from AF to M or autofocus to manual, and that will give you a consistent focus. Now, a word to the wise, don't recompose the photograph at this point because the objects that you were focused on at that distance may change. So if you're, say, zoomed all the way in at 55 or 85 millimeter, and then you pull back to 18 millimeter after getting a focus lock, you're going to need to do it all over again. It's a little cumbersome, but it's worth the time because then you end up with really sharp shots at night. Right now I'm standing on a dock. The dock moves. So it was important for me to reduce the amount of time I made my exposure for, that way to reduce the amount of shake from the water moving back and forth. Here we have in the background the San Diego skyline. I made a few different photographs to kind of give you an idea of what I try and do every time I go out. You get a very different feel every different location. So make sure that you have a set number of settings, a baseline, and then that way you can experiment with the light from there. But if you don't have that, you're going to be throwing darts at a dartboard. It's not going to be pretty. You're going to come back with 400 or 500 shots and only 1 or 2 of them are going to work out. By doing it this way, you get an idea of what the light is like in each location in your area, and then you can go, set up, take the picture, and it's done. So, I'm going to stop talking for a second. I'm going to make a few photographs and I'm going to show them to you.
So here you go. This is the fruit of the labor here. Um, we did our test shot, ISO 400 at 3.5 at 30 seconds, and it was too bright, so we went down to 100 and then reduced our time down to 10 seconds, and this is what we got. For better, for worse, there's things I don't like about it. There's too many highlights in some areas. I might want to go a little bit darker, maybe more like 5 seconds, which is probably what I'll want to go with. But it always looks a little different in the back of the camera. Keep that in mind. So here we go.
Now we're going to talk about the ever popular HDR photograph. Typically, as you can see from a lot of my shots, you don't really need a lot of HDR, but if you are a big fan of it and you want to get as much range as possible, you want to go ahead and make multiple photographs at different exposures. I found that at night photographs are a really awesome way to maintain those really creamy waters and those really silky, smooth moving skies, that having the time be the variable is the best way to go. So what I do is I start with my baseline settings, as I said before, ISO 400, 30 seconds at f3.5. By doing this, I again have my baseline image. As we discussed earlier, it's a little too bright. So you find the correct exposure that works. In this case, it was ISO 100, 10 seconds at f3.5. That was the perfect shot. So what I do from there is make that exposure, and once I find that that exposure works, I make an additional shot, 20 seconds, then another shot, 30 seconds, maintaining ISO 100 and 3.5, and then I reduce the time, 5 seconds, 2.5 seconds, and 1 second. Now you can do HDR with as few as 3 shots and going up from there. I found that once you get to 9 shots, you really are getting repetitive. It's not really necessary to go much past 9 shots. I mean, there's some guys that are wizards at it and they can do amazing things. They've got all kinds of software and they do amazing post-production work. Typically, I range anywhere between 3 shots and 9 shots to get a decent HDR photograph. Typically, I don't even post them because I prefer getting it right one shot in camera. So, I'm going to show you now all 6 different shots that I use to make one HDR photograph, using the San Diego skyline as my example.
So now you understand the basic premise of HDR photography. I get 6 shots. That's typically how I do it. I get the highlights, the midtones, and the darks, and it gives me a good range of color because there's different light sources and different colored lights in the city skyline, and I want to make sure I get the full range. Now, I also pick a specific image because I feel like if you get the right shot in the camera, the exposure is going to be pretty comparable to what the HDR image looks like. And I think there's benefits to using one shot in camera rather than doing HDR. So typically when I post a picture for people to see, it's typically the one shot in camera. I almost never post HDR shots, and if I do, I say, hey, look, this is an HDR shot. But I'll show you the side-by-side comparison. First, I'll start with the HDR, and then I will show you the non-HDR, and let you decide. And I did this for a couple different examples. So here we have the shot with HDR. There's definite more clarity in the highlight areas. It's not as blown out, but it has, I don't know, almost too clear of a quality to it. The non-HDR here, this is the right out of the camera shot with a little bit of post-processing. It has just a different feel to it. Here I did another shot. I did pano, which is 2 shots side by side, and I did 1 shot HDR processing, and then photo merged them later after I did HDR processing on both side by side shots, and then I picked the 5-second shot again for this other version, which is the non-HDR shot. And here we have those pano version shots zoomed in at 100% on the buildings across the way, so you can see here the HDR. And here's the non-HDR. The HDR clearly had more quality in the highlights, it's a better light quality, but you know, just a different overall look. Winner of the day was an HDR shot. I really like how it came out. Check me out at dlcphotographs.com for more tips, images, and tutorials.